One of the things I had to do in the book was to think about Marx's theory of social change, the dynamics of economic and social change. And again, I used my understanding of what he does as opposed to the one-liners. And what he does is to suggest, and the way I represented it was to say, look, there are 7 moments in the social process. One is about the relation to nature, another is about the nature of technology, and then there's social relations, and then there's production, there's daily life, there's mental conceptions of the world, institutional arrangements. And all of these hang together as a totality, and all of them co-evolve. And if you look at the dynamics of the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, what you'll see is a movement across all of those dimensions. The relation to nature was fundamentally reconfigured. Technologies, obviously, and social relations and mental conceptions, all of them changed dramatically, as did daily life. But capitalism is a permanently revolutionary force. And if you think about the way in which all of those elements hung together, say in 1970, and how they hang together today in a particular geographical place, you would see a different kind of world. You know, I mean, there were no photo. Can you imagine living in a world with no photocopying machines? I mean, when you did your courses back then, you had a Roneo and you turn it around. Yeah, you remember, right? You turn it around and this horrible pink mauve kind of thing came out, and you had to run them off one by one. Of course no cell phones and all this kind of stuff. But also the social relations have changed a lot in all sorts of dimensions, including, of course, the social relations which are associated with labour and work and the meaning of work and the like. And while you can kind of say there was alienated labour back in the 1960s, which is true, it was alienated in a very different way than it is today. The alienation today is very much more about insecurity, and it's all about repressions of various kinds. So it's a different kind of world, and of course the social solidarities which compensated in some ways for those alienations through, I don't know, even trade union organisation and institutions of that kind are no longer as powerful and significant as they once were. And there have been dramatic transformations in technology. I mean, when I was reminded of this a couple of weeks ago, I was in Baltimore and I met a steel worker who's employed at Bethlehem Steel. There are now 2,500 people employed at Bethlehem Steel. Back in the 1960s, there were 37,000. And we all know what that has meant in terms of So yes, there are transformations in the form that alienation takes and the like. But what this also suggests is that technology and technological configuration is only one dimension. I mean, and there's a tendency to think of Marx sometimes as emphasizing the technological dimension, and often the one-liner is the productive forces, revolutions in productive forces, are at the root of history. Well, if that's the case, how come the chapter on machinery and modern industry, where Marx talks about the way in which capitalism defined its own technology, comes at the end of the story, not at the beginning? In other words, in the 17th century, capitalism was erected, as he says, on the basis of feudal technologies and organizational forms. In other words, capitalism was already there on the basis of that technology. But it reached a limit in terms of that, and it had to therefore redefine the technological mix which was distinctively its own. So then the chapter is, that long chapter is about how it did that, which is then also about transforming mental conceptions. So that, for instance, the word technology or industry in the 18th century was associated with art. So you'll find arts and industries kept together. There's a metro stop in Paris called Arts et Métiers, but then it became technology and science, and this became so the technological moment is just one moment, and the notion of co-evolution becomes therefore very, very important, and therefore that leads me in at the end to talk about a co-revolutionary movement from capitalism to socialism or communism or whatever. In other words, you cannot imagine a revolution which is going to be simply on one of those dimensions. It has to be on all of those dimensions, in institutional arrangements, daily life, and all the rest of it. And there's no one single major problem in the world right now that doesn't require all of those elements to be revolutionized in some way. You think of climate change. You want to do something about climate change? Everybody says, oh, there's a technological fix. Well, actually, no. You can't deal with that without changing daily life. We have to change our daily lives. Now, nobody wants to change it. They say, solve this climate problem without changing my daily life. Impossible. Okay? Change social relations. You know, change production systems. All the rest of it. You've got to change all of those elements. So I started to come up with a co-revolutionary theory and say a social movement has to grasp a revolutionary theory. Now, this brings me back to the first question. Is capital in crisis? There's a difference between is capitalism in crisis and are the capitalists in crisis? And actually, capitalists very frequently get themselves into a configuration where, acting in their own self-interest, they are prepared to actually crash the whole system. And Marx recalled several moments where that's the case. I mean, the chapter on the working day is one of them, but also, you know, some of the stuff about environmental degradation is also there. In other words, capitalists don't necessarily act in such a way as to preserve capitalism. And of course, one of the things that happened back in the 1930s was that actually a large segment of the capitalist class got behind the idea of actually transforming the system to save capitalism. And they realized they had to give up something in order to do it. Right now, we are in exactly the opposite situation. As I see it, it's not only individual capitalists are basically prepared to crash the whole system in order to try and preserve their own particular wealth and power, but factions of capital are prepared to do that. And you see that, I think, most clearly in terms of the dynamics of Wall Street. Wall Street folk, you know, believe they are entitled, think they do fantastic things for everybody. Although I have to tell you, living where I live, I occasionally come across a drunk banker in a bar in Upper East Side, and one the other night actually started crying, and he looked at me and said, "It's all fraud. It's all fraud." I wish I could get him on tape, you know. So your question is a very appropriate one. For them, you know, for George Soros, this is not a crisis, you know, and for John Paulson, this is not a crisis. This is a great opportunity. They're racking it up. Now, Soros is an interesting character because he does see that there's a real systemic problem, and you've got to try to save capitalism in order to, you know. So in the long run, he is concerned about that, but the rest of them are not. So right now, you can kind of see this systemically that capitalism is likely to change its spots. Now, capitalism is in crisis in a variety of ways. For example, the whole kind of the fiscal stuff right now is really pretty hairy. And I think they are prepared to continue to create more and more fictitious capital for precisely the reason that real production is not terribly remunerative. So we could move into a world in which they sort of, and you know, there's this. It's very interesting. Giovanni Arrighi always used to use this Brodelian view that there are three levels. There's the market level, and then there's daily life level, and then the capitalists are in the attic almost, sort of playing games up in the attic. And they're not about the market at all. They're just about simply gathering wealth and power. And it looks to me actually we're more and more like in that kind of model. That actually we try and live our daily lives in a situation where the market is supposed to be acting to the benefit of all, whereas there are these people up the top who are actually manipulating pretty much everything they want, including information, including political process, as well as the market. So I think the question is a good one. Who's in crisis? Well, you know, there's a lot of people in this country in crisis. There are people who have come out of crisis. In say China, where you know, if a lot of peasant populations have been incorporated into the labour process, they went through a real problem at a certain point, and there was this crash in China, and then they've come out of it a little bit, and now, of course, there is this very interesting moment where, for whatever reason, the government is either prepared or feels forced to tolerate strikes, and is actually contemplating a very Keynesian move, which is to re-empower labour by raising wage rates. And so wage rates in China have been shooting upwards, with an interesting kind of corollary, which is there's offshoring out of China now. Jobs are going out of China to Cambodia, and you can kind of say, well, that's liberating Cambodia in a certain kind of way, and yeah. There's a sort of a joke, and there's about there's only one thing worse than being exploited, and that's not being exploited. And I kind of there's that kind of dynamic, and there's always this problem about the dynamics of capitalism, and I don't think that capitalism has historically been all bad at all. It's created a situation of a sort where we can actually construct something which is radically alternative. And the big question is, why aren't we doing it? Yeah. One, two. Let me get one, two, and three. Right.
I wanted to make a quick aside about your comment of fetishization among a lot of left groups. Renata Adler wrote a funny article in about 1967 or 68 about the New Left Convention. It was here in Chicago. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is I remember a quote from Upton Sinclair when he ran for governor of California. He first ran as a socialist. He got like maybe 60,000 votes. Then he ran on that epic thing. I think it was economic progress in California. He got like 800,000. And he was saying that Americans are never going to accept socialism.
Right.
The label it as
Right.
such. So I was hoping that you might make some comments of how you can deal with those sort of confirmation biases and fundamental attribution errors that are, okay, our elites have sold all the jobs off, to China, cheap labor, cheap resources. So who do we blame? The impoverished Mexicans that are dispossessed because of NAFTA, who come here just for the jobs that none of us would take in a heartbeat.
Sorry, who was next? Yeah.
From everything you've said, everybody said capitalism is going to come out of it. And the reason I asked that is when you mentioned Origi, Manning Wallerstein, you said in the 70s the system was going down the tubes. And it does seem, at least to some of us more pessimistic than you, it is going to go down the tubes. And sort of a related question, since none of us have the ear of Wall Street bankers except when they're drunk as skunks at a bar. There are a number of, what we might call the left bourgeois economists that are alternative answers. For example, when you shared a platform with Albrecht not too terribly long ago, that the whole system is a Ponzi scheme because of illegal greed. And then you get even better one, Krugman, who's bad regulators, and with Reich, we need more consumption. Now, these ideas are just as silly as God knows what, but, my question is, given the fact that the bourgeois economists have no more clue, Marxists do, why do you think we're going to get out of it? Why do you think we're not going down the tubes and going down big?
I always thought the definition of the working class as being doubly free was better than working in industry. But that said, it seems to me that we need a new. The thing that made the industrial working class a good job, pay well, and all this was a series of labor movement in the 30s and 40s. But so it seems to me we need a new labor movement today. What do you think of the prospects of this? International free of the Democrats, like that could actually turn the poor low-wage jobs that we have now into good jobs. And just real quick, you did mention kind of the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, right? You kind of brought that up. And it always seemed to me that I've always been suspicious of how much of a division there really is between those. It always seems more of a symbiotic relationship. So what do you think about that?
Well, it's symbiotic as far as my pension fund is concerned. Yeah. I listen to the news and I rub my hands with glee, and then I think about my pension fund.